There's no doubt that the modern age has brought about mankind's most advanced inventions. In just the 20th century, it took us 66 years to go from the first powered flight to landing a man on the moon. Technology has advanced so rapidly since that even the most expensive computers from a few decades ago are dwarfed by the processing power of current cell phones. Knowing this, mankind's history, beyond a few hundred years, can seem pretty primitive by comparison. Thinking of the past, you might envision centuries upon centuries of people not bathing often enough, experiencing regular famine, and dying young from illnesses that are highly treatable today with the simplest of antibiotics. But we're here to tell you that this isn't the full picture. Yeah, our ancestors did have it rough, and we're not going to argue with the fact that life is certainly better today than it used to be. But that said, the people of the past were far more intelligent than we often give them credit for. Despite their comparative lack of resources, they developed a surprising amount of knowledge about the world, technology, and innovations long before the modern era, a few of which we're going to explore today. Just before we continue with today's video, let me tell you about the internet, specifically the scary part of the internet, the privacy intruding part of the internet. There are bad actors out there. There are even ISPs who are they're looking at your data and they're selling it. Or if they're a bad actor, they could even be using it for nefarious purposes. But Surfshark allow you to protect yourself. They're a VPN, they encrypt all of your traffic so you don't have to worry. No one will be able to see what you're up to. It's just like a big blur of indecipherable information to them. That's what encryption means. I mean, it means more than that. But that's what you need to know to understand what Surfshark does. Surfshark is your digital guardian angel protecting all of your internet escapades with just a single click. It's incredibly easy to use. You just download it on whatever device you want, and you click go. You click on the country you want to connect to, and it's just like that. It's super easy. So you can be safe on public Wi-Fi. Also, if you want to browse content from another Netflix library, or lately for me, it's been Disney Plus, jumping over to another country and you get a whole lot of other stuff that's not available on your local Netflix. Each country has their own library. It's very cool. Surfshark allow you to access it all. So all you need to do is use the promo code Sideprojects and you'll get an extra 3 months for free at surfshark.deals/sideprojects. Stay safe out there. And now back to today's video. Considering that maths is a difficult subject for many people today, kids and adults alike, it can come as a shock to learn that even thousands of years ago, there were people that were remarkably good at it, and they paved the way for modern logic and calculation. Many innovations and new ideas in maths are attributed to Pythagoras, who was born in 570 BC. After all, he has the very famous Pythagorean theorem named after him, but we actually don't have any surviving records written by him, only second-hand sources, and there are many hints that a lot of what he's credited with had already been figured out in other parts of the world. According to some sources, Pythagoras himself first began studying maths in Egypt, and indeed the Egyptians had a shockingly advanced understanding of maths as far back as 4,000 years ago. The Rhine's papyrus, for instance, is dated to originate from around 2000 BC and appears to be an instruction manual for math students. Essentially, it's one of the world's oldest textbooks, and it includes multiplication and division tables, fractions, geometry, and hints that Egyptian scholars from long ago had other knowledge, such as the existence of prime numbers. They were also the first to figure out how to solve linear and even simple quadratic equations, which, let's be honest, would make them better at maths than the majority of adults today. Evidence like this suggests that while we tend to attribute a lot of mathematical discoveries to Pythagoras and his Greek peers from around their time, it's very possible that many of their innovations had been known in the scholarly world for many centuries beforehand. After all, if the Egyptians understood linear equations, it doesn't sound unreasonable for them to have figured out something as relatively simple as the Pythagorean theorem. It's just really hard to gauge who exactly invented what when we're looking so far back in time, as we're working with a very limited set of records. Another thing the Egyptians were close to figuring out was the value of pi, which they calculated to be 16 over 9 divided by 2. That comes out to 3.16. Not perfect, but awfully close. In fact, it's accurate enough that if you're trying to solve for the area of a large circle with a radius of 50 meters, the correct answer is 7,854 square meters, and the Egyptian pi would get you 7,900. Off by a little bit as you work with larger scales, but certainly useful enough for practical purposes like estimating how much construction material you need for a project. But pi is one instance where the Greeks did indeed take a big step forward. Archimedes calculated the lower and upper bounds for pi, placing it somewhere between 3.1408 and 3.1429. Similar values were found around this time in China as well, using the same method, and Chinese scholars would continue to narrow down pi's value until Louis Hui correctly solved the first 7 digits in the 3rd century AD, which would stand as the most accurate approximation for nearly 1,000 years. Seeing all of this, it really starts to come as no surprise that these civilizations were able to build impressive ancient structures like the pyramids of Giza. No aliens necessary, it's just human ingenuity. Often accompanying maths throughout the ages has been the study of the night sky, and astronomical discoveries and calculations are among the most impressive feats of ancient civilizations. Some of these discoveries even predate the ancient Egyptians, and by quite a large margin at that. The Warren Field, for instance, is an ancient site in Scotland that was first excavated in 2004, and it was studied for 9 whole years before researchers realized just how significant a finding it was. In the Warren Field are 12 pits, which allowed an observer to track lunar months. This site also aligns with sunrise at the winter solstice, which allowed for it to be periodically adjusted and maintained over the years to keep it accurate. What's utterly insane about Warren Field is that this lunar calendar dates back to at least 8,000 BC, making it by far the oldest calendar in the world, and as far as we can tell, even predating written language. The site was occupied and used for nearly 6,000 years, and was meticulously maintained the entire time, with the archaeological record showing evidence of hundreds of adjustments made over the millennia in response to shifting solar and lunar cycles. What's even more impressive about this site is that when it was first created, people in this part of the world hadn't yet figured out agriculture, so this is quite literally a lunar observatory made by hunter-gatherers. By the year 1200 BC, the Babylonians were beginning to map the night sky, creating detailed star catalogues and had the ability to predict the rising of Venus, showing some of the first evidence of astronomers realizing that the planets were distinct from the stars and that they showed up in predictable periodic intervals. Now, while we did take a bit of credit away from the Greeks in the maths department, there is a lot of credit due to them in the realm of astronomy. The first recorded heliocentric model came from Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century BC, an unbelievably advanced idea for the time, which wouldn't gain mainstream popularity for another 1,500 years. Meanwhile, Eratosthenes estimated the circumference of the Earth to a high degree of accuracy thanks to a combination of maths and astronomy. Remarkably, after converting to modern units, he was only off by 66 kilometers, an error margin of 0.16%. He achieved this by measuring the difference in shadows cast by a rod during the summer solstice in 2 different cities. The simplified version is that one of the rods was placed in the city of Syene, which, thanks to astronomers, had been found to be very close to the Tropic of Cancer, meaning that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun would be directly overhead and the rods would cast no shadow. The second rod was placed in Alexandria, where at the same time on the summer solstice, a small shadow would be cast. Eratosthenes measured the shadow, and then, using the shadow and the rods as 2 sides of a triangle, figured out the angle at which the sun's light was reaching Alexandria. Then, by knowing the distance between the 2 rods, he had enough information to extrapolate these solutions and figure out the curvature of the Earth between the cities, and scale this up to estimate the entire size of the Earth. Like we said, that was the simplified version, as the real method involved several trips and surveys of professional bemetists, specialists in Egypt who measured territory and distances for tax purposes. 1,700 years later, Christopher Columbus studied Eratosthenes before his historic Atlantic journey. However, he opted to believe a different, more recent estimate that claimed the Earth was about 25% smaller. If he would have gone with measurements from Eratosthenes, when he made landfall in the Bahamas, he wouldn't have mistakenly believed that it was the Indies. Instead, he would have immediately known that it was uncharted land. But the size of the Earth wasn't the only astronomical discovery of the ancient Greeks. They also utilized a device called the Antikythera mechanism, which has been heralded across the internet for years as one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history, but whose actual purpose is now believed to be a tool for tracking the motion of celestial objects and predicting eclipses. It also seems to have served a dual purpose that allowed a user to track the 4-year period between Olympic events. It appears to be the first example of an analog computer, which makes you wonder what other advanced tools they had which have just been lost to time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Earth, the Maya were fascinated by the night sky. Beginning sometime around the 1st century and lasting until the general Maya collapse several centuries later, astronomy was studied in depth, with the Maya predicting eclipses, commemorating solstices, and observing and recording the motion of several planets. And all of this had an undeniable impact on their architecture. For example, some large stelae, or standing rock pillars, include an 819-day count for tracking a cycle associated with Jupiter, and many buildings are oriented to line up with the sunrise or sunset on certain dates. One of the more impressive is the temple at El Castillo in Chichen Itza, where the sun casts a shadow on the stairs in the shape of a serpent, only visible during the spring and autumn equinoxes. Not coincidentally, the temple served the deity Kukulkan, the Mayan-feathered serpent. One of the most striking things about ancient cities is the evidence that so many of them were intricately planned. Instead of just adding houses and buildings next to each other over time, many settlements clearly indicate that the city layout was intentionally designed with specific goals in mind. And this goes much further back than even the Romans or Greeks. As far back as 2600 BC, settlements in the Indus Valley made the transition from scattered settlements into large urban communities, many of which were constructed with a high level of organization. One of these is Mohenjo-Daro, which around the year 2500 BC had an estimated population of 40,000 people. The buildings were all made of similar materials, fired with mortared brick, with additional smaller structures made of mud bricks. Houses, markets, and other buildings were laid out in a grid fashion, with the city divided into residential and business sectors. They also had numerous public facilities, such as a large city bathhouse, large assembly halls for citywide meetings, and plenty of wells all around the city for quick access to fresh water. Waste channels lined the roads so that it could easily be drained, and the city had large platforms which are believed to have acted as defense against flooding, since it appears that this was a common threat at the time. There's even a room which appears to feature a bath with a furnace underneath it, maybe representing history's oldest hot tub. However, Mohenjo-Daro is not the only example of fantastic city planning in ancient times. The Romans were famous for their highly organized urban centers, with grids of streets, sewage disposal, and aqueducts to provide clean water. Water from these aqueducts was of no cost in many cases, as several cities were dotted with public fountains and baths, and these public fountains were often given priority over the residences of the elite. This is the kind of convenience that you expect in a modern city in a well-off nation, but these services were being enjoyed by people over 2,000 years ago. The history of medicine is filled to the brim with horror stories of terribly dangerous theories, surgical failures, and outright lunacy. But this only tells half of the story, as a few civilizations actually seemed to have had a decent grasp on medicine for the time, even without the benefit of the knowledge of microorganisms and anatomy that we have today. The ancient Egyptians are one such civilization. A lot of what we know about this comes from a single papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which contains information possibly dating all the way back to 3000 BC. The Edwin Smith Papyrus details the steps of curing various ailments, beginning with examining the patient, diagnosis, treatment, and how to keep a wound from being re-injured afterward. This is remarkable because it contains almost no religious or mystical suggestions. It is a text almost entirely dedicated to rational, empirical study of the human body, taught through 48 case studies. The only mysticism involved are a few spells near the end, which seem to be used either to close and bless the operation or simply as a desperate last resort if nothing else was working. But aside from these, the text is very straightforward in nature and shows an early way of thinking similar to today's scientific method. Honestly, this probably makes it more effective than several so-called alternative treatments that you can find online today, despite the papyrus being as old as the pyramids. The text outlines that there are 3 types of diagnoses, one which you are confident you can treat, one which you will attempt to treat, and one that cannot be treated. Most of this deals with surgery and trauma, such as how to close an open head wound or how to put a splint on a broken arm. It even goes as far as to recommend immobilization for patients with spinal and neck injuries, showing an understanding of the danger of paralysis in such situations. One of the most interesting parts is the recommendation to use honey to prevent a wound from getting infected. It sounds odd at first, but most bacteria cannot reproduce or grow in honey, making it actually quite an effective barrier to keep harmful microbes out of a healing cut. Obviously, the Egyptians had no knowledge of microorganisms this far back in history, but through years of observation and testing, they'd correlated honey with reduced complications and passed that information on to their students, which is pretty darn impressive. And remember, like with many other things that we've covered, this is only a fragment of the full knowledge. They certainly knew more than remains on the record. Really, the true tragedy here is that so much of this knowledge throughout history was repeatedly lost and had to be rediscovered. Wars and famines continually held back scientific advancements, as did the lack of long-distance communication to collaborate with other great minds around the world. Really, there were a handful of factors that kept our ancestors from accelerating and building upon this knowledge like we have in the last couple of centuries. But there's no denying that what they accomplished and what they figured out about the world was quite impressive, given the limited tools they had at their disposal.